The ancient curse shattered Arabella Dumont's hands first. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The black veins crept up from her fingertips to her wrists the moment she pressed her palms flat against the obsidian seal on Dorian Drakul's chest, and every vampire in the grand hall of Drakul Manor gasped as one. The sound was like wind through a graveyard, cold and collective and deeply afraid, and Arabella had never heard vampires afraid before. She had only heard them dismissive, contemptuous, bored. "Get her away from him," someone snarled from the crowd, a tall vampire with copper hair and ancient eyes shoved forward through the gathered court. Lady Vespera, Dorian's second in command, the woman who had spent 3 weeks making Arabella's life a calculated misery. She is a maid, a human maid. She has no right to touch the Duke, and she certainly has no right to attempt a breaking. The blood law forbids it. Arabella did not move her hands. The black veins climbed past her wrists now, threading toward her elbows like ink spreading through water. Pain moved with them, deep and grinding, the kind of pain that made her vision pulse at the edges. But she had made a decision 3 minutes ago in the corridor outside this hall, when she had watched Dorian Drakul collapse for the 3rd time in 10 days, his white hair soaked in cold sweat, his silver eyes hollow and distant, his proud body folding inward like a king surrendering a crown he could not hold anymore. She had made her decision then, and she was not a woman who unmade decisions simply because they hurt. "The seal is responding," said another voice, quieter, older. Arabella recognized it as belonging to Councillor Mirso, the eldest vampire on Dorian's court, a man who had watched empires rise and dissolve from the same armchair. She had served him tea 11 times in the past month. He always said thank you, which made him unique.
"Everyone be still. The girl knows something. The girl knows how to fold linens,"
Vespera snapped. "Then explain," Mirso said very calmly, "why the Drakul seal is cracking." The silence that fell was absolute. Arabella exhaled slowly through her nose and pushed deeper into the seal, past the burning, past the black veins spreading toward her shoulders, past every rational instinct in her body screaming at her to stop. She could feel Dorian beneath her hands. Not his chest, not muscle and bone and the cold architecture of an immortal body. She could feel him, the consciousness behind all of that, the ancient vast awareness that was Dorian Drakul, the thing that made him a duke and a ruler and a man capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary honor. He was drowning in the dark, and she had found the edge of the water, and she was not going to let him sink. The seal cracked down the center with a sound like a cathedral bell struck once, very hard in total silence. Light exploded from the fracture, silver white and blinding, and Arabella was thrown backward across the hall. She hit the marble floor hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. And then Dorian Drakul opened his eyes. 3 weeks earlier, Arabella Dumont had arrived at Drakul Manor with a forged reference letter, 40 euros in her coat pocket, and a very specific mission that she had told absolutely no one about. The manor itself sat behind Bucharest's old city like a secret the city had agreed to keep. Tucked between a converted Orthodox church and a building that officially housed a private bank but actually housed the regional vampire administrative offices, which Arabella knew because her older sister Petra had worked there as a human liaison for 2 years before the incident. The incident was the reason Arabella was here. The incident was the reason she had spent 8 months learning everything there was to know about vampire blood laws, ancient seals, and the specific nature of the Drakul curse that had been slowly killing the most powerful vampire duke in Eastern Europe for the past 60 years. The manor's human staff manager, a nervous little man named Gregor who sweated constantly and spoke in the rushed tones of someone who had survived too many vampire moods, had looked at Arabella's reference letter for approximately 4 seconds before looking up at her. "You have no experience in aristocratic household service," he said. "I learn quickly," Arabella said. Gregor looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, the way she looked at everything, without flinching. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned efficiently away from her face, sharp grey eyes that her mother had always called her grandmother's eyes, meaning practical and hard and quietly seeing everything, and a posture that she had trained herself into over years of working jobs that required her to be invisible while remaining useful. She was not tall, not particularly imposing, Not the kind of person anyone looked at twice in a crowd. That was one of her greatest advantages. The position is difficult, Gregor said with the emphasis of a man delivering a warning he genuinely meant. The Duke is unwell, the court is tense. Several of the previous human staff have requested transfers. To where? Arabella asked. Anywhere else, Gregor said with a sincerity she found oddly refreshing. She was hired that afternoon. She was assigned the upper residential wing, which included the Duke's private corridor, and which every other human staff member had fought actively to avoid. Arabella had specifically requested it, Gregor, showing the first spark of genuine self-preservation she had seen from him, looked at her for a long moment, and then simply wrote her name in the assignment ledger. The first time she saw Dorian Drakul in person was the following morning. She was polishing the corridor floor outside his private study at 6 in the morning, which was the hour the vampires, who kept unusual schedules, were most active, when the door opened and he walked out. He was tall. She had known that from photographs, from court records, from the careful documentation her sister's organization kept on the major vampire nobility. But photographs and documents did not capture the quality of presence that Dorian Drakul carried with him like weather. He wore dark trousers and a grey shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his white hair loose around his shoulders, and his silver eyes moved immediately to her with the instinctive alertness of a predator who catalogued every living thing in a space the moment he entered it. He looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds. She looked back at him steadily and continued polishing the floor. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet anything close to warmth. Something more like the small recalibration of a very precise instrument encountering unexpected data. "You are the new assignment," he said. His voice was low and very even, the kind of voice that had learned over centuries to communicate authority without effort. "Yes, Your Grace," Arabella said. "You are not afraid of me," he observed. "Should I be?" she asked, the shift in his expression again. More pronounced this time, moving toward something she might have called interest, if she had not been entirely focused on appearing to have no interest of her own. He walked away down the corridor without answering, and Arabella watched the rigid line of his shoulders and the slight heaviness in his step, the quality of movement that belonged to someone carrying pain they were too proud to acknowledge, and she filed everything she saw into the careful archive she was building. The court was something else entirely. Drakul Manor housed 17 vampires of various rank and relationship to the Duke, plus a rotating cast of visitors from other courts who came to pay respects or to observe, with varying degrees of concealment, the state of the Duke's health. Because the secret was not truly a secret in vampire society. Everyone knew Dorian Drakul was cursed. Everyone knew it was killing him slowly, had been killing him for 6 decades, and that no one had found a solution. Every vampire blood specialist, every ancient court scholar, every self-proclaimed cursebreaker from the oldest families in Europe had attempted to address the seal and had failed. The seal was old magic, older than most of the vampires alive, drawn from an oath broken in blood, and it had woven itself into Dorian's essence with the patience of something that knew it had time. What the court did not know was that Arabella's sister Petra, working quietly in the human liaison office next door, had spent 18 months translating a set of documents from the Drakul family archives, documents so old that the vampires themselves could no longer read the original dialect. She had found the counter working. She had found the exact conditions required to break the seal. And then she had disappeared, and the documents had disappeared with her, and Arabella had found her sister's research hidden in a waterproof case behind the radiator in Petra's apartment, along with a note that said simply, "Do not let them see you look." So Arabella did not let them see her look. She polished floors and changed linens, and served tea, and moved through the manor like furniture, like shadow, like something the court's occupants noticed only in the peripheral way that people notice useful, silent things. She listened to conversations that were not meant for her ears. She observed the pattern of the curse's progression in Dorian's behavior, the days when the seal tightened and he withdrew entirely into his study, the days when it eased marginally, and he appeared in the hall with that contained, furious energy of a man fighting something internal and winning temporarily. She watched how the court responded to his weakness, Which members protected their positions by performing loyalty while privately enjoying the spectacle, which members were genuinely afraid, and which single member, Vespera, was actively maneuvering for a political outcome that would benefit from his continued decline. Vespera was the dangerous one. Arabella had identified that in the first 48 hours, but it was Dorian himself who complicated everything. Because Dorian Drakul, she discovered over 2.5 weeks of careful proximity, was not what she had expected. She had built a profile from documents and records and her sister's notes, and the profile was of a ruthless, brilliant, ancient political operator who ruled by the absolute authority of his bloodline and the terror of his reputation. All of that was true. She could see it in the way the court arranged itself around him, in the way visitors from other families arrived already angled toward deference, in the way even Vespera, for all her maneuvering, never quite met his eyes directly when he was fully alert and focused. He was genuinely dangerous, genuinely powerful, genuinely capable of the kind of authority that made the air in a room feel different when he entered it. But he was also, in the private hours when he thought no one was watching, something else. She caught him standing at the window in the corridor outside his study at 2 a.m, looking out at the city lights with an expression of exhaustion so total and so unguarded that it stopped her in the doorway. He was holding a book he was not reading. He had been standing there, she realized, for a very long time, and there was something in the angle of his shoulders, not the rigid controlled line he wore for his court, but the true line beneath it, that spoke of a loneliness so deep and so long-standing that it had become part of his architecture. 60 years of slow dying, 60 years of watching his court watch him decline. 60 years of refusing to yield to something that should not have been able to touch him in the first place. She withdrew silently, and he never knew she had been there. 2 nights later she knocked on the study door. He said enter in the tone of someone who expected Gregor with a problem. And she opened the door and came in with a cup of tea she had made exactly as she had observed him drinking it, strong and without sugar, and set it on the desk beside his papers without comment. He looked at the cup, he looked at her. It is past midnight, he said. Yes, Your Grace, she said. The night staff does not include residential service at this hour. No, she agreed, and waited, a long pause. He picked up the cup, and he drank. Arabella Dumont, he said, reading her name off something in his memory rather than from any document in front of him. Gregor tells me you requested the upper wing assignment. I did, she said. Why? She had prepared for this question since her first day. She had a true answer and a safe answer, and she calculated for approximately 1 second that this specific man, would respond better to the former. Because everyone else avoided it, she said, and I wanted to understand why. He looked at her with those silver eyes that held 6 centuries of accumulated observation in them, and she looked back with her practical, quiet, hard seeing. Something passed between them, not yet trust, not anywhere near trust, but the first faint acknowledgement of it as a future possibility. And have you understood why? He asked. I am beginning to, she said. She left him with the tea and the silence, and she did not look back. And she was halfway down the corridor before she allowed herself to acknowledge that her heart was beating considerably faster than it should have been for a simple professional interaction. She attributed it to the risk. She was very good at attributing things to rational causes. The following week was when the danger became real. Vespera had noticed her. Not as a maid, not as furniture, not as one of Gregor's useful human appointments. Vespera had noticed her specifically, which meant Arabella had made an error somewhere in her concealment, and she spent 2 days trying to identify it before concluding that she had not made an error at all. Vespera simply noticed everyone who spent some time near Dorian as a reflex of political survival, and the fact that Arabella had been near Dorian with some frequency had tripped the wire. Come with me, Vespera said to her on a Tuesday afternoon. In the way that powerful people speak to those they consider entirely powerless, without request, without explanation, without any acknowledgement that the other party might have their own interior complexity. Arabella followed her into a small sitting room on the 2nd floor, and stood while Vespera closed the door and turned to examine her with the particular brand of cold, calibrating interest that Arabella recognized as the precursor to either recruitment or elimination. You have been spending time near the Duke, Vespera said. I clean his corridor, Arabella said. It is my assignment. You also bring him tea at midnight. He seemed to require it, Arabella said, in the tone of someone saying something entirely ordinary. Vespera was beautiful in the way that ancient vampires were beautiful, which was to say completely, precisely, and without the vulnerability that usually accompanied beauty in human faces. Her white hair was arranged in an elaborate knot, her skin was alabaster, and her expression was the expression of someone who had spent several centuries learning to conceal exactly what she was thinking, while conveying exactly what she wanted others to believe she was thinking. It was a very sophisticated face. I need someone near him, Vespera said. Someone he does not view as a political entity. Arabella waited. You will report to me his condition daily. Daily? What he eats, how he sleeps, whether the episodes are increasing in frequency. You will do this quietly, and you will receive certain protections and benefits in return. Arabella kept her expression exactly as neutral as it had been throughout the conversation. You are asking me to spy on the Duke for you, she said. I am asking you to be useful, Vespera said, which is what humans in this house are supposed to be. A long pause. Arabella looked at Vespera with her grandmother's eyes. I will think about it, she said. She had no intention of thinking about it. She had, however, learned something valuable, which was that Vespera's interest in the Duke's decline was active and specific, and that the timeline was tightening. If Vespera was recruiting observers, she was preparing for something. Arabella increased her own pace accordingly. That night she requested a meeting with Merceau. This was itself a kind of calculated gamble. Merceau was ancient, subtle, and aligned with the Duke by a loyalty that predated the curse by centuries. He was also, she believed, the only member of the court who might listen to a human maid without immediately dismissing what she said. She had been bringing him tea for a month. She had been watching him think. She had observed that he was the kind of man who evaluated information on its quality, regardless of its source, which made him exceptional among his kind and possibly the only ally she could access. She knocked on his door at 10 in the evening. He opened it himself, which surprised her. He was very old, even by vampire standards, with white hair so fine it was nearly translucent, and eyes that were the pale amber of very old amber, the kind you found insects preserved in. He looked at her with the mild, patient attention of someone who had learned to be surprised by nothing. Miss Dumont, he said, come in. She told him almost everything. Not about Petra, not about the documents hidden in her apartment because that was her leverage, and she was not yet certain of the ground beneath her feet. But she told him she had been researching the Drakul curse, that she believed there was a counterworking that had never been properly attempted, and that she needed two things from him: his silence and his presence in the great hall on a night she would specify. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Why would you risk this? He asked when she had finished. His tone was not skeptical. It was genuinely curious. The question of a man who had watched humans and vampires alike act from hidden motives for 600 years and retained, against all evidence, an interest in the particular configuration of each new person's reasons. She was quiet for a moment. She gave him the true answer. Because he is dying of something that should not be able to kill him, and no one who has the means to stop it has been willing to pay the cost to try. I am willing. The cost is significant, Merceau said quietly. If you have correctly identified the counterworking, the contact required to break an oath seal of that age, and nature will cause the curse's energy to redirect through you on its way out. It will not kill you if the working completes, but it will not be painless. I know, she said, another long pause. You are in love with him, Merceau said, not accusatory, not even particularly surprised, just observing. Arabella opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at her hands for a moment, which was the first time in the entire 2015 she had looked away from him. I have not made that determination, she said, which was both entirely true and entirely evasive, and they both knew it. Very well, Merceau said with the gentleness of someone choosing not to press. I will be there 3 nights from now, I think. His condition is deteriorating, and I believe Vespera intends to call a court succession meeting within the week. If you have a solution, it must be before that. Arabella nodded. She stood to go. Miss Dumont, Merceau said. She paused at the door. He is not easy to love, the old vampire said. He has been alone a very long time. He has built considerable architecture around that. You should know that even if you break the curse, what comes after will require patience. I have patience, she said. Yes, Mirso said, with something in his expression she could not quite identify. I rather think you do. The next 2 days were the most careful of her life. She maintained every aspect of her routine without deviation. She polished floors and changed linens and served tea and moved through the manor like shadow, and she did not let Vespera see anything, and she did not let anyone see anything. And she rebuilt the internal map of the great hall, and its distances and the positions of the court members who would be present and every possible variable she could account for. On the second of those days, something happened that she had not accounted for. She was coming around the corner at the end of the upper corridor, carrying a pile of folded linens, when she heard the sound that had been becoming familiar over the past weeks. The sharp involuntary sound of someone absorbing significant pain, followed by the absolute silence of someone refusing to make that sound twice. She turned the corner and found Dorian bracing himself against the wall with one hand. His white head bowed, the seal on his chest visible through his shirt as a black mark the shape of an old knotwork sigil, and it was glowing with a dim red light that pulsed in time with his breathing. She set the linens down on the floor. She walked to him. He looked up at her approach. His silver eyes were fierce with contained pain and something else, something that looked almost like humiliation, the humiliation of being seen in weakness by someone he had not chosen to see him. His jaw was locked. The muscle in his cheek was working. Your Grace, she said. Go away, Arabella, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and she could tell by the slight shift in his expression that he had not meant to. The pain had loosened something in his control, something small but real. She did not go away. She stepped closer and looked at the seal, not with fear, not with the horrified fascination she had seen on the faces of court members who accidentally glimpsed it, but with the focused, clinical attention of someone examining a problem they were actively working to solve. She had read enough about it to recognize the particular configuration of its pattern, the oath it had been drawn from, the specific cruelty of its design. It is tightening because you have been refusing to rest, she said quietly. He stared at her. I beg your pardon. The curse feeds on effort, Your Grace. When you exhaust yourself fighting it, it takes the energy and uses it to pull tighter. Petra's research was very specific about that. She stopped. She had not meant to say that. She had been very careful not to say that. His silver eyes changed. Something ancient moved in them, a kind of sharpening that made the air in the corridor feel suddenly very different. Petra Dumont, he said, very quietly. The liaison who disappeared. The silence between them was extremely careful. She is my sister, Arabella said, because there was no point in concealment now, and she was not built for pointless concealment. She found the counterworking in your family archives. She vanished before she could act on it. I believe Vespera's people are responsible for that. I am here because I intend to finish what she started. The look on his face was something she had not seen there before and would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not quite shock, because he had lived too long for true shock. It was not quite anger, though there was anger in it, directed inward at himself for not having seen her clearly sooner. It was something closer to the expression of a man who had been standing in a dark room for a very long time and had just become aware that there was a door behind him. You came here for me, he said, not as a maid. I came here because of my sister, she said. The rest I will not explain right now because you need to sit down before the seal closes another degree and you lose an hour to recovery time you do not have. He sat down. He sat down against the corridor wall like a man who has stopped arguing with gravity, and she sat beside him on the floor, her back against the wainscoting, and she talked him through the breathing pattern she had found in Petra's notes, the one that counteracted the seal's tightening by refusing to give it the resistance it fed on. He listened. He listened. He did the breathing. After 20 minutes, the red pulses in the seal faded to nothing, and he looked marginally more like himself. They sat in the corridor for a while after that without speaking. Your sister, he said finally. Is she alive? I believe so, Arabella said. Vespera would not have made a martyr of her if she could avoid it. More useful to disappear her quietly and hold her as leverage against anyone who might use the research. She will be with Vespera's secondary residence, he said, and the tone was the tone of a man making a promise through a statement of fact. I know the location. When I am well, I will retrieve her myself. Arabella looked at him. He was looking at the ceiling, at the ornate plasterwork of a house built to impress and intimidate, and there was something in his profile at that angle. Something in the way the low corridor light fell across the sharp planes of his face that made her throat tighten in a way she was still refusing to fully examine. When you are well, she said. Yes, he said, and then, after a pause, with a precision that suggested it cost him something to say. Thank you, Arabella. She did not let herself think about how her name sounded in his voice. She was too busy thinking about the following night. The night of the counterworking arrived with a tension she could feel in the house around her, or perhaps she was projecting, or perhaps she simply had the heightened sensitivity that came from being very afraid and very resolved at the same time, and refusing to let either state show. She had observed over her weeks in the manor that Dorian came to the great hall every evening to conduct whatever abbreviated court business his condition allowed, a deliberate performance of normalcy that she recognized for what it was, a refusal to let his court see the retreat, a refusal to yield even the appearance of authority to something that was taking everything else from him. He would be there. She had told Mirso to ensure the court was gathered. She had also sent a very brief, very careful message through a trusted channel to the monitoring organization Petra had worked with, the Human Liaison Group, alerting them to watch Vespera's secondary residence that night. If things went wrong in the hall, she wanted someone with authority looking in the right direction. She was in the great hall there at 7:45 in the evening, ostensibly polishing a section of floor near the back wall, actually positioned exactly where the geometry of the room put her at the center point between the primary load-bearing pillars, which the architectural documents she had studied indicated were the original structural anchors of the building, and thus the points of maximum energetic convergence. Petra's research had been very specific about geometry. Oath seals of the Drakul family's age were bound to the physical space of the family's primary residence as much as the individual carrying them, which was why 60 years of external cure attempts had failed. The seal needed to be broken here. In this room, with the building's own architecture acting as a circuit, Dorian arrived at 8. He walked into the hall with the particular quality of movement she had come to think of as his public walk, contained and precise and radiating the kind of controlled authority that had not diminished with the curse because he would not allow it to diminish. He wore dark formal clothes, his white hair pulled back, and his silver eyes swept the room in the fast, comprehensive way that was pure instinct after centuries. They found her, a fraction of a second's pause. Then he moved to his chair. The court arranged itself. Vespera was present, positioned as she always positioned herself, close to the center of power, close enough to be necessary, far enough to have maneuvering room. She looked at Arabella once, a look that said she had not forgotten the unanswered recruitment offer, and was filing the outstanding balance. Arabella waited. The business of the court moved around her. Reports and responses and the quiet political calculations that filled every aristocratic gathering, regardless of whether the aristocrats were human or centuries-old creatures of the night. She had learned to read the room's temperature over weeks of observation. Tonight the temperature was high, tight, the particular tension of people waiting for something to shift. The shift came at 8:40. When Dorian pressed his hand flat against his chest, with the involuntary abruptness of a man taken suddenly by pain, and the black light of the seal showed through his shirt for just a moment, and the court went very quiet in the way it always did when the Duke showed weakness, the held breath quiet of people calculating what this means for them. It was the moment. She knew it was the moment. The seal was active, engaged, burning, and that meant it could be engaged from the outside, which was the condition Petra's research required. She set down what she was carrying, and she walked through the room to Dorian, and she did it without hurrying, without stealth. Just walked directly to him with the steady, quiet purposefulness. She carried the way other people carried tension. He looked up at her approach. His expression moved through confusion, and then a sudden bright recognition. His eyes said, "Do not do this," with the urgency of a man who has understood all at once what she intends, and is deeply, thoroughly afraid for her, not for himself, for her. And that fear in his eyes was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, and it did something irreversible to the interior architecture she had been so carefully maintaining. "Arabella," he said, very low. "Be still," she said, very gently. She placed her palms flat against the seal, and the room erupted. She had gone through the next part of this account already, in the first moments of this story, because those were the moments that had unmade and remade everything. The black veins, Vespera's outrage, Merceau's steadiness, the court's collective fear, the crack of the seal splitting down the center, the blast of silver-white light, the marble floor. What she had not accounted for was how the light felt when it passed through her. It was not pain exactly, or not only pain. It was the sensation of something very old and very wrong being pulled out of the world, the specific relief of a hook being removed, which hurts in the removing but leaves behind a clean wound rather than a festering one. She felt the curse's energy move through her like a current, vast and cold and furious, and she felt it exit from her hands, back into the air, where it dissolved into nothing. And she felt the moment of its dissolution as a sound that was not quite a sound, more like the cessation of a sound she had been hearing. For so long she had stopped registering it as noise. Then the floor was very hard and the hall was very bright, and there was a great deal of sound around her. The first thing she saw clearly when the light faded was Dorian on his knees beside her on the marble, his white hair loose around his shoulders, his silver eyes wide and fierce and entirely focused on her. The controlled, regal, dangerous presence she had catalogued was still there, but stripped of everything that was performance, stripped down to something raw and immediate and deeply human, despite everything he was. "Look at me," he said. "Arabella, look at me." "I am looking at you," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not expected her voice to be steady and was mildly pleased by it. He took her hands in his. He looked at the black veins that had receded but not entirely gone, still threading faintly up toward her forearms. His expression was something she had no calibrated name for something too complicated and too unguarded for her careful observation system. His grip on her hands was very careful, the careful grip of someone extremely strong who is being extremely careful, and she felt it all the way through her, that controlled strength, applied with such deliberate gentleness. "You should not have done that," he said. "Someone had to," she said. "Arabella." Her name again, just her name, in that voice that was no longer the public voice, no longer the authority voice, the real one. "You came into my house with a forged reference letter to break a curse on a man you had never met." "I came for my sister," she said, which was still true and increasingly incomplete. He looked at her for a long moment. The hall was full of sound around them. Merceau moving through the room with the quiet authority of someone taking control of a situation. The court reacting and regrouping, and someone dealing with Vespera, who had made an attempt at the door that had been physically blocked by two of Dorian's loyal guard. None of it was Arabella's immediate concern. Her immediate concern was the look in Dorian's eyes, which she could no longer attribute to a rational cause. "Your sister," he said quietly, "is safe. I sent Casimir to retrieve her from Vespera's secondary house the moment I understood the situation. He will have her within the hour." Arabella stared at him. "When did you send Casimir?" "2 nights ago," he said, "after the corridor." The breath went out of her, not from the curse, from that, from the simple extraordinary fact that this ancient, proud, difficult, extraordinary man had quietly arranged the thing she needed most before she had even asked, had done it without telling her, had done it simply because it was the right thing to do. And he was, beneath all of the architecture and the authority and the 6 centuries of accumulated defense, the kind of man who did right things. "Oh," she said. "Yes," he said, with something very close to dry humor moving in his voice, which was its own kind of intimacy, that brief warmth. Then quieter. "You knew the cost of the counterworking. You knew it would come through you." "Yes. And you did it anyway." "Yes, Dorian, his name, not your grace." His name, which she had never used before, and it hung between them in the air with the weight of an acknowledgement. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, the silver was the warmest it had ever been, which was still very silver, still very deep. but with something in it that was neither threat nor assessment, nor the contained endurance of a man fighting a losing battle. Something else entirely. Something she recognized despite never having seen it there before. "We should get you to Merceau," he said. "The residual lines need to be addressed before they settle." He helped her stand, and he did not let go of her hand, and she did not pull it away, and neither of them commented on this. Vespera was dealt with before morning. Merceau had prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for this specific opportunity for a very long time, and the blood law case against her was constructed with the kind of ironclad precision that left no room for political navigation. She had arranged the disappearance of a human liaison who had been operating under diplomatic protection. She had actively impeded attempts to address the Duke's medical condition by suppressing information her office held. She had been recruiting court members to her own political agenda in direct violation of her oath of service to the Drakul line. The evidence was comprehensive, documented, and presented to the assembled court by Merceau in the measured tones of someone who had been assembling it for weeks. Vespera stood through the presentation with the composure of someone who had prepared for the possibility of failure, which Arabella supposed was simply good planning. She offered no denial. She offered instead the argument that everything she had done had been in service of the court's stability, which was the argument of someone who had decided to go down with her own logic intact. Dorian heard it all from his chair, which he occupied for the first time in weeks without the grey quality of pain around him, his back straight and his eyes clear, and his authority fully restored to him in a way that the court members kept looking at, with the wary recalibration of people adjusting to a familiar room, after all the furniture has been put back into its correct position. He ruled against Vespera on all counts. Her removal was immediate, and her exile from the Drakul court was permanent. She was escorted out by Casimir, who had returned in the early hours with Petra Dumont, safe and furious and dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. The reunion between the sisters was not conducted publicly, which was Arabella's specific preference. She had been brought to a sitting room off the main corridor, where Merceau had supervised the careful treatment of the residual curse lines on her arms, a process that involved an extremely precise application of old working that Merceau conducted with the focused delicacy of a surgeon, and that hurt considerably less than the initial experience, and she was sitting with a cup of tea and the slightly unreal sensation of someone who has been living on adrenaline for a very long time and has just run out of it when the door opened and Petra walked in. Petra was 3 years older than Arabella, which meant she was perpetually convinced she knew better, which was an argument they had been having since childhood, and which Arabella found deeply comforting in the current moment. Petra looked at her sister. Arabella looked at Petra. Petra burst into tears, and Arabella, who never cried and had not cried in years, started crying too, and they held each other in the small sitting room of a vampire duke's manor in Bucharest while the ancient house settled around them into something new. "You broke the seal," Petra said when they had both composed themselves, which took a while. "Your research was very good," Arabella said. "You could have died," Petra said. "I was not going to die," Arabella said. Petra looked at her with the older sister look. "Merceau told me about the curse transfer. The energy load alone should have." "But it did not," Arabella said. "I read all your notes, Petra, every document. I knew exactly what I was doing." A pause. Petra looked at her with a slightly different expression now, the one she got when she was processing a situation that had more layers than she had initially estimated. "Did you really come here for me?" she asked, with the precision of someone who has spent time around creatures that detect lies very easily and has learned to appreciate specific truth. Arabella picked up her tea. "I came because of you," she said, which was accurate and complete and left a great deal of space in it, and Petra was too smart not to notice the space. "Arabella," Petra said. "He was dying of something that should not have been able to kill him," Arabella said quietly. "And no one was doing anything, and you had found the answer, and then you were gone, and the answer was just sitting behind your radiator doing nothing, and he was still dying." She paused. "I could not leave it there." Petra was quiet for a long time, then gently, "What are you going to do now?" Arabella did not have an answer ready, which was unusual for her. She was still working on it. What she did over the following weeks was, outwardly, relatively simple. She remained at the manor. Meursault had extended a formal invitation of continued residence in terms that made it clear this was a genuine offer and not a courtesy, and she accepted it on the basis that there was still residual monitoring needed for the curse lines, and the manor needed someone with a working knowledge of the entire incident to ensure nothing resettled incorrectly. These were both true reasons and also not the whole story, and everyone in the house knew it and no one commented on it, which she appreciated. Petra returned to the human liaison office next door, where her return from a disappearance that everyone had officially been told was a voluntary sabbatical caused a quantity of paperwork that kept her entirely occupied for the first 2 weeks and prevented her from making any additional observations about her sister's choices. The court reformed around its restored duke with the speed and efficiency of a system that had been under strain and could finally return to proper operation. Members who had been hedging their positions toward Vespera's ambitions found themselves very busy with duties that kept them away from Dorian's immediate vicinity, which was a form of grace that Meursault administered with diplomatic excellence. New appointments were made. The Drakul line's regional alliances, which had been fraying as word of the Duke's decline spread through the vampire court networks, were quietly reinforced by a series of meetings that Dorian conducted with the full restored force of his presence and authority. He was himself again. More so, perhaps, than he had been for 60 years. Arabella saw the difference most clearly in the small things. The way he walked through the manor now, not the careful, measured walk of someone managing pain, but the full, unhesitating movement of a man who owned this space completely. The way the court responded to him, not with the held-breath calculation of people watching a situation for signs of further decline, but with the immediate, genuine deference of people in the presence of something that commanded it without effort. The way he ate, drank, engaged in conversation, occupied the room, the quality of him, fully present in a way he had not been, could not have been, while the curse was taking everything he had. She was glad. She was glad in a way that had nothing rational to it, a way that filled the whole chest cavity and made ordinary things feel very bright. He came to find her on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the breaking, while she was in the library on the first floor, which had become something of a habit. The library was the best room in the house. She had decided this early and maintained the position. It had tall windows and deep chairs and approximately 10,000 books in 11 languages, and it smelled of old paper and cedar and the particular quality of rooms that have been used for serious reading for a very long time, and she found it genuinely restorative, in a way she would not have necessarily predicted about herself, but accepted as true data. She heard him come in. She did not look up from her book immediately, which was a small, deliberate thing. A choice not to perform responsiveness. After a moment, she marked her page and looked up. He was standing in the doorway, his white hair loose because it was evening, and the formal court day was done. Wearing dark clothes that had no particular formality to them, and he was looking at her with the look she had been filing away in a separate category for 3 weeks, the look she still did not have a fully adequate name for, but had been unable to stop noticing. "May I?" he said, meaning the chair across from her. "It is your library," she said. "It is increasingly our library," he said, and sat down. And the ease of it, the naturalness of sitting across from her like something they had always done, settled over the room with a warmth she felt distinctly. They sat for a while, in comfortable silence. This was one of the things she had discovered about him over the past weeks, that he was a man who could be genuinely quiet with another person. Not the silence of disengagement, but the silence of presence. The kind that meant the other person's company was satisfying enough that nothing needed to be added to it. She found it extraordinary in someone who carried so much authority, so much history, so much that demanded articulation and performance. With her, he was simply present. "Meursault tells me the residual lines are fully resolved eventually." "Yes," she said. "He checked them yesterday." "Clean. Good," he said. The word was simple and completely insufficient for the look that accompanied it, which was something deep and relieved and privately fierce. Another pause. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to adequately address what you did." "You do not need to address it," she said. "Arabella, that precision of tone. Her name used as the statement it had become between them, as shorthand for something that did not have a comfortable shorter form. You walked into my house under a false identity and broke an oath seal that 6 centuries of my bloodline's resources could not break, at significant personal cost, for a man you had never met, because you could not leave a problem unsolved when you had the means to solve it. She considered this. That is a fairly accurate summary, she said. It is the most remarkable thing anyone has ever done for me, he said, in a very long time. The library was quiet. Outside the tall windows the city moved in its modern way, traffic and light, and the distant sounds of a Thursday evening in Bucharest, and inside the room the distance between them was approximately 4 feet of good carpet, and an enormous amount of accumulated feeling. "Your Grace," she began. "Dorian," he said, with the authority of someone correcting an error, "we have established the precedent. You called me Dorian in the Great Hall, and I am not prepared to revert from that." She felt something move in her chest, warm and unwilling to be rationalized. "Dorian," she said, "I did not do it to be remarkable. I did it because it needed doing, and I was the person who could do it." "I know," he said. "That is part of why it is remarkable." He looked at her across the 4 feet of carpet with those silver eyes that had the whole depth of 6 centuries in them, and also, in this moment, something very immediate, something that belonged entirely to the present, to this room and this hour, and the specific 2 people occupying them. "I find," he said carefully, with the precision of a man choosing words the way other people choose weapons, "that I have very little interest in you leaving." She looked at him. She let herself look, fully, without the careful cataloguing, without the professional neutrality, without the protective architecture. She looked at the sharp planes of his face, and the white hair, and the silver eyes, and the still, controlled, powerful presence of him, and she looked at what was underneath all of that, what she had been seeing in glimpses for weeks. The man who stood at windows in the dark holding unread books, the man who had quietly arranged her sister's safety before she asked, the man who had learned her name from his own internal record before he had any reason to, the man who said it like it meant something specific. "I find," she said very quietly, "that I have very little interest in leaving." He stood up. She stood up. The 4 feet of carpet resolved itself without any particular drama into no feet at all, and he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, close enough that she could see the particular quality of silver in his eyes from this distance, which was extraordinary. He raised one hand and touched her face, very lightly, with a care that she understood was deliberate, was chosen, was an ancient, proud, dangerous man, being as gentle as he knew how to be with something he was afraid of frightening. "I want to be clear," he said, "that I am not a simple man." "I noticed," she said. "I am 600 years old, and I have a great deal of history, and I have not allowed anyone near enough to matter in a very long time, and I am not certain I know how to do this correctly." "Neither am I," she said. That seemed like a reasonable place to start. The look on his face then was something she would carry for the rest of her life. It was the look of someone hearing a door open that they had been standing outside of in the dark for longer than they could clearly remember. The look of disbelieving and beginning to believe simultaneously. He kissed her with the same quality of care that he had in his hands, deliberate and contained and achingly attentive, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. And the library was warm around them, and the city moved outside the windows, and the ancient house held them both in its oldest room. The weeks that followed were, from the outside, a period of quiet consolidation for the Drakul court. From the inside, they were something entirely different, something growing with the particular patience and intensity of things that had been deferred too long by too many circumstances, and are now allowed their full expression. Dorian was not an easy man. He had said so himself, and he was accurate. He had centuries of accumulated solitude built into his patterns, centuries of being the authority in every room, centuries of having the full weight of his bloodline's obligations and reputation and power resting on him, without assistance. He forgot sometimes to simply be present rather than to manage. He defaulted, when stressed, to a contained authority that pushed people away rather than toward him. He had strong opinions about nearly everything and expressed them with a directness that could be startling. Arabella found all of this completely workable. She was not a woman who needed someone uncomplicated. She was complicated herself in her own different ways. Her careful concealment and her relentless practicality and her habit of solving problems before she allowed herself to feel them, and the grief about her sister that she had been carrying for 8 months under the polished surface of her careful mission. She was not uncomplicated either, but they were, she discovered, remarkably good at the same table. They argued, which they both apparently needed, and the arguments were never destructive because they both operated from honesty rather than from tactics. He respected her intelligence with a completeness that she found both satisfying and occasionally amusing, because he was 6 centuries old and had met rather a lot of people and was still willing to say directly, "You are right and I was wrong." And she knew what that cost him and loved him for paying it. She loved him. She had stopped hedging that determination somewhere between the library and the second week of November, and she had told him so in the same library on a rainy evening while they were reading, and he had set his book down and looked at her for a very long moment with an expression of such concentrated feeling that she had thought briefly that he might not be able to answer. Then he had said, "I love you." In the careful, precise way he said everything that mattered, and she had felt it all the way through her like light. Petra, upon being informed, said, "I knew it," and then immediately retracted this, and said, "I suspected it," and then immediately retracted this too, and said, "I am happy for you, Ara," which was the truth, and meant more than either of the others. Merceau, upon being informed, said, "I know," with the tone of a man who had known since the corridor, and looked quietly satisfied in the way that only very old beings look, when something they have waited a long time for finally resolves correctly. There was a court gathering in December, a large formal occasion that involved the attendance of representatives from 4 other major vampire courts in the region, the kind of event that Dorian's court hosted annually as an exercise in alliance maintenance and political visibility. It was the first such gathering since the breaking of the curse, and it would be the first occasion on which Arabella would appear at Dorian's side in an acknowledged capacity rather than as a member of the household staff. She had opinions about this, primarily that it was as unnecessary and that she was not interested in the performance of it, and she told him so. He listened to her opinion with complete seriousness, and then told her that her presence beside him at this gathering was not negotiable, which was one of the moments when the dominant ancient vampire duke aspect of his character was extremely legible, and she told him that she would attend under her own terms. He told her he would expect nothing less. This was apparently their version of agreement. She wore a dark green dress that she had selected herself and which she felt extremely capable in, which was her primary criterion for clothing in high-stakes situations. She wore her hair down, which she rarely did, and which Dorian, when he saw her, looked at with an expression that she filed away as data. The gathering was large and glittering, and full of the beautiful alabaster-skinned, white-haired creatures of various courts who regarded her with reactions ranging from open curiosity to careful neutrality to the particular frosty assessment of people who have decided that a human woman beside a vampire duke is a statement they find inconvenient. She moved through it with her grandmother's eyes, and her polished floor posture, and the steady, unhurried grace of someone who has nothing to prove. Dorian moved through it with her beside him, which was itself a statement, spoken in the language these people understood. He introduced her to the other court representatives as Arabella Dumont, the woman who broke the Drakul curse, and he said it with a quiet, factual pride that was absolutely devastating. Several of the older court members from the visiting courts reassessed their initial reactions visibly upon hearing this, which she found interesting. Apparently breaking an ancient oath seal with your bare hands was legible as credentials in this world. There was one moment of genuine difficulty, midway through the evening, when a visiting lord from the Western Court, who had had too much of whatever lords of his age and disposition drank at parties, decided that Arabella's presence was an appropriate topic for his unfiltered opinions. His opinions were that humans had no place at vampire court functions except in a service capacity, that the Drakul line was diminishing itself by allowing such an association, and that certain other courts had begun to question whether the Duke's judgment could be trusted, given recent events. He said all of this with the confidence of someone who had operated without consequence for long enough to have forgotten that consequences still existed. Dorian turned from the conversation he had been having with another guest, with a slowness that was more frightening than speed would have been, and looked at the Lord with an expression that was not anger, which would have been more comfortable. It was something colder and more absolute than anger. It was the expression of someone whose patience had run entirely out, and who was no longer making any effort to conceal it. "Let me clarify," Dorian said, in the voice that was not raised and required no volume to fill the immediate space entirely. "The woman beside me walked into my house with nothing but intelligence and courage, and broke a curse that 6 centuries of my bloodline's collective resources could not address. She did this, knowing the cost, and paid it without complaint, and has never once asked for a single thing in return. You will speak of her with respect, or you will remove yourself from my house, and I will ensure that the circumstances of your removal are very thoroughly understood by everyone you intend to speak to about my judgment." The silence that followed was absolute. The Lord looked at Arabella. She looked back at him with her grandmother's eyes, steady and direct and entirely unimpressed. He looked away first. Later, when the gathering had thinned and the visiting representatives had begun their departures, Dorian found her near the window she had retreated to while he managed the concluding diplomatic courtesies. He came to stand beside her, and they looked out at the city together, and the reflected glow of it was in the glass and on his face, and she thought about the night she had seen him at a window like this, alone, holding a book he was not reading, with that exhaustion of someone who has been fighting too long. "The Lord from the Western Court," she said, "will not be invited again," he said. "I was not concerned about him," she said. "I know," he said. "I was." She looked at him. He was looking at the city, but his hand found hers beside him on the windowsill, and he held it with that same deliberate, careful strength, that controlled tenderness that she had learned to recognize as one of the most characteristic things about him. The care he took with her that he took with nothing else. "I do not need you to defend me," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I also know that what I want is not always identical to what is necessary. I wanted to." He paused. "I will spend a very long time wanting to protect you from things you are entirely capable of handling yourself. You should probably know that in advance." "I probably already knew it," she said. "Yes," he agreed. But it seemed worth stating clearly. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Outside the city was lit in all its modern complexity, the old and the new, layered over each other, the way this city always was, the ancient beneath the contemporary, the history just under the surface. The Drakul manor sat in it like what it was, a very old thing that had survived everything by being precisely and completely itself. "What happens now?" she asked, meaning the large question, the one about the shape of things going forward. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should like to stop thinking of this as a question with a single answer. I should like to think of it as a long project with many phases. We have done the first part." He looked down at her. "I was hoping you might be interested in the rest of it." She was quiet for a moment too, looking at the city. She thought about Petra, back next door in the liaison office, already working on 3 new projects and periodically sending her messages that were officially professional and occasionally catastrophically sentimental. She thought about Mirso, who would be in his own rooms with his books, satisfied in that particular old way of his. She thought about this house which she had come into as a stranger with a forged letter, and which had become, somewhere in the weeks of polished floors and corridor conversations and library evenings, something that felt irreversibly like the place she belonged. She thought about the man beside her, with his 6 centuries and his complicated architecture and his careful hands and his silver eyes that looked at her like she was something that had permanently altered the landscape. "Yes," she said, "I am very interested in the rest of it." He brought her hand up to his mouth and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the old-world gesture, formal and entirely sincere, and she felt it all the way through, the warmth of him, the weight of everything he was and had been and would continue to be, resting against her hand like an offered gift. January came with cold, clear days and long, dark evenings, and the particular beauty of the old city in winter. When the snow settled on the older rooftops, and the lights came up early, and the streets near the manor smelled of cedar and cold stone and distant river. Arabella had settled into the manor in a way that was no longer temporary, no longer conditional, no longer framed by a mission or a pretense. She had her own rooms on the upper floor, the same corridor she had once cleaned, which had a symbolism that both she and Dorian acknowledged once and then let rest. She had established a working arrangement with the Human Liaison Office next door, consulting on cases involving court members and human staff, which used her peculiar combination of skills and knowledge in ways that felt genuinely useful rather than imposed. She had also begun learning Romanian, which Dorian taught her on Wednesday evenings in the library, which was entirely counterproductive as an educational exercise due to the consistent tendency of Romanian lessons to become other things. But she was making progress. There was one remaining piece. She had known it was coming for weeks, had felt it in the particular way. Unfinished things make themselves felt, a low, persistent awareness that something needed resolution. On a bright, cold morning in late January, and she found Dorian in his study, and she sat across the desk from him the way she had never sat across from him when she was the maid, and he was the Duke, and the entire situation had been built on concealment and careful distance. "I need to tell you," she said, "the full account of how I came to be here." He looked at her. "I know most of it," he said. "You know the structure of it," she said. "I want you to know the rest," and she told him. The real beginning, which was not Petra's disappearance, but the night 8 months ago when she had been sitting in her sister's apartment, reading through Petra's research, and had felt the specific quality of clarity that comes when something that was theoretical becomes urgently real. The moment she had understood that the counterworking was achievable, and that no one with access to the information was in a position to act on it. The decision, which had not felt at the time like a grand choice, but like a simple one. The kind you make when you see a fire, and you have water, and there is no reason to walk away. She told him about the fear she had carried through the forged letter and the interview with Gregor, and the first weeks of careful observation. The fear not of death, she was not particularly afraid of that, but of failure, of coming so close, and making an error that would mean the counterworking was impossible, and Dorian died of something she could have stopped. She told him about the first time she had seen him and what she had noticed. She told him about the corridor conversation and what it had cost her to keep her face neutral through it. She told him, finally, about the moment she had made the decision to press her hands to the seal, which was not in the great hall, but 3 weeks earlier, when she had sat beside him on the corridor floor and talked him through the breathing pattern and felt, in his exhausted and unguarded presence, the exact weight of someone who had been carrying too much alone for far too long. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she had finished, there was a silence. "You were afraid," he said. "The whole time, of failing," she said. "Yes, not of me," he asked, with a quality of careful interest that made her think this mattered to him. "No," she said honestly, "I was never afraid of you." The something in his expression that she had spent months learning to read moved through several things she could now identify clearly. A private grief for the fear she had carried alone, a profound relief at the specific fear she had not had, a fierce private gratitude that it was her, that it had been this specific person who had come through his door with her forged letter and her grandmother's disguise and her absolute refusal to be moved from what she intended. He came around the desk and pulled her to her feet and held her, which was something he did with the same quality as everything else he did, completely, the full strength and warmth of him, without reservation. She held him back. "I am sorry," he said against her hair. "For 60 years of a curse that meant my house was a difficult place for a very long time." "That is not something you did," she said. "It is something I was," he said. "Something you walked into anyway." She pulled back enough to look at him. He looked at her. The study was bright, with winter morning light, and he was beautiful in it, impossibly so. All that white hair and silver intensity and the precision of his face. But what she was looking at was the man inside all that, the complicated, magnificent, difficult, honorable man who had been alone too long and was no longer, who had been dying of something that should not have been able to touch him and was no longer, who held her hand like it was something important because it was. "Dorian," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would walk into it again," she said. "All of it, every day of polished floors and careful concealment, every moment of the breaking. He made a sound that was not quite a word, something low and moved and entirely him, and then he kissed her in the winter morning light of his study, thorough and warm and unhurried, the kiss of two people who have all the time they need and know it. Spring arrived in increments. The snow came off the manor rooftops, and the trees along the old city streets began their slow, complicated return to green. The Drakul court settled into its new configuration, reorganized around a duke who was fully present, and an acknowledged arrangement that the court had absorbed with the pragmatic adaptability of people who understand that politics is ultimately about what the power in the room decides, and the duke had decided, and the matter was closed. Petra had lunch with them both on a Sunday afternoon in March, the first time she had been inside the manor in a social rather than professional capacity, and she spent the first half of it being extremely professionally composed, and the second half being completely herself, which meant she asked Dorian 17 questions about vampire blood law, with the focused enthusiasm of a scholar in proximity to a primary source, and he answered all 17 with the patient thoroughness of a man who had decided that this particular human's intellectual energy was entirely acceptable to him, which was his way of saying he liked her, and Petra could tell. And Arabella watched the two of them across the table, with a private fullness in her chest that she made no attempt to rationalize. Merceau joined them for the last part of it, ostensibly to deliver a document that could easily have waited. Actually, because he had known about the lunch and had decided his presence was called for. He sat at the corner of the table and drank his tea and watched the four of them, two ancient vampires and two young human women, with the expression he had been wearing since the night in his rooms when Arabella had come to him with her almost full confession and her specific requests satisfied. That was the word. Not smug, not congratulatory, not any of the things a lesser person might be. Deeply, quietly satisfied. The way people are when something they have hoped for without any guarantee of its possibility has come to pass exactly as it should. On an evening in late April, when the city outside was warm and the manor windows were open to the air. For the first time in months, Dorian stood behind Arabella at the window of their library, his hands on her shoulders, her back against his chest, and they watched the city together. The old church next door had its lights on for an evening service. The bank building, which was not really a bank, had the ordinary lights of an office operating late. Somewhere down the street someone was playing music. I used to stand at windows, he said, and watch the city from the wrong side of the glass. I know, she said. I saw you. He pressed his mouth to her temple. She felt it all the way through, the warmth and the deliberateness of it, the 6 centuries and all the complicated history, and the man who was both of those things and was here, now, with her, at this window on this evening, with the spring coming through the open frame. Not anymore, he said. No, she agreed. Not anymore. The city moved below them, ancient and modern, layered and alive, carrying its own centuries of history under the surface of its bright contemporary face. The manor held them, the library held them, the evening held them, and beyond all of it, the long future stretched out ahead, not without complexity, not without difficulty, not without the inevitable negotiations of two very different people, navigating very different worlds and histories and natures, but rich with it, full with it, enormous with the particular promise of something that had been found and chosen and kept. Arabella Dumont, who everyone had underestimated from the moment she had walked through the manor door with her forged letter and her steady eyes, had broken an ancient curse on a vampire duke. She had found her sister. She had outlasted a betrayal that had been decades in the making. She had walked into the heart of an old and dangerous world and had not been diminished by it. And Dorian Drakul, who had carried 6 centuries and a curse and a loneliness so long it had become structural, held her at the window with the careful strength of someone who had learned what it meant to have something worth being careful with. Outside, the city shone. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be.